Okay, hello everyone. So we are in week 3, or starting week three of our course, and this week we're going to be focusing on novellas. So you read some short stories, and there's some things that novellas share with short stories in terms of characteristics, but they're also sort of in between short stories and long stories, or long narratives and novels, and we'll talk about that. So I wanted to start by looking at the lenses readings that you had for this week. So the first one is focusing on character. So characters, of course, are very important to narratives. And oftentimes with short stories, we don't have as much room to develop characters as we do with novellas and with longer narratives and novels. So some things that are important are sort of terms that are important to know regarding characters. The difference between flat characters and round characters. So flat characters are often sort of identified by a few traits. We don't get a very deep perspective of those characters. Round characters are much more developed, characters whose inner workings are revealed to us as readers. So protagonists are often round characters, whereas sort of characters that are in maybe part of a text or for certain scenes or more oftentimes sort of viewed as flat characters. If they're only there for a short time, if we don't get a lot of information about them, if we only know a few traits about a character, those would be flat characters versus our characters that we're following and sort of understanding the inner workings of those characters or round characters. We also have dynamic characters and static characters. So dynamic characters are ones that undergo major changes, and they often have some sort of epiphany or sort of moment of recognition in the text. So with short stories and novellas, that's often something that is a sort of significant singular epiphany that often is sort of coupled with a climax or is related to the sort of conflict, the major conflict of the story. However, with novels and with longer narratives, we have room for more epiphanies for characters to sort of learn and develop and to continue to grow and change. So there might be multiple epiphanies for characters within sort of longer narratives. Static characters are ones that undergo very little changes, so slight changes or no changes. So characters that seem to sort of remain the same. That have very little change in terms of their personality, in terms of their sort of conflict or inner struggles, ones that are not changed in some way. So these are characters that would not have any sort of epiphany, that would sort of persist in staying the way they are throughout the text. And as Lenses points out, that does not mean that the static characters are insignificant or that they can't play major roles in the text, but they just don't go through a lot of change. So the example they gave was Daisy from The Great Gatsby. So Daisy is a very important character in terms of the conflict and the plot of The Great Gatsby, but she doesn't undergo a lot of change. We don't see her sort of grow and shift as a character. So those are things to sort of keep in mind when thinking about characters and trying to define characters. Other terms that we use with character are protagonist and antagonist. So protagonist being the main character of a narrative. It isn't a sort of rule that we only have one protagonist. Sometimes there are narratives that we switch in and out of people's heads, or we have characters that are several sort of protagonists. Well, then we'll have a couple of them. We'll have a couple main characters that we're following. But oftentimes, protagonist is sort of, we look for the protagonist, but it's important to keep in mind, too, that there might be multiple protagonists, and to be open to that, depending on what kind of narrative it is. Likewise, we might have more than one antagonist. So particularly with longer narratives, this is something that we might see. So different sorts of adversaries to the protagonist or protagonists. So these can be sort of your strict villain types, or maybe more complicated characters that we can't classify them as sort of pure evil like a villain, or that they're not sort of static in that way, but they present some sort of adversarial context in relationship to the protagonist or protagonists. And then archetypes, when we think about archetypes, so these are specific kinds of common characters. So characters that are often sort of viewed as stock types or specific types of characters. Some examples of that, we have the heroine or heroine, characters that must overcome some sort of challenge or challenges in the narrative. So often those are the conflicts that contribute to the rising action and the climax, the sort of challenges that the hero or heroine is facing. Those would also be our protagonists as well in the story. Villains, like we just mentioned, so representations of evil, often in stark contrast to the protagonist. So whereas if the hero is the sort of good character, the pure character, then the villain is the evil adversary of the main character, the protagonist. There are some other different types of archetypes that I've outlined here, and your book has more examples, so I'd encourage you to make sure to go back and look at that. So there's several different types that are mentioned there. For our purposes, with our sort of theme for our class, the outsider is a significant archetype. So characters that are marginalized, that are outside of society in some way, whether that is of their own choosing or if they are pushed outside of society. Foils are characters that have qualities that contrast with the protagonist, but who can be easily compared to the protagonist. So he can be sort of juxtaposed, or perhaps there's some similarities, but there are key differences. So if the characters have some sort of main goal, the same common goal, but they have different character traits, we might consider that type of character a foil. So the example your book gives is King Claudius and Hamlet. So Claudius, driven by his desire for power, Hamlet introspectively ponders his position and the loss of his father. So they're sort of at different positions in this struggle for power and this sort of questioning of their roles in the with the royal status, the royal family, and who's going to be on the throne for Denmark. Allies are characters who support the hero or the protagonist in some way. So they might be, friends and developed characters. They might have a little bit more dynamicness to them, or they might be static characters. Characters that are sort of helping the protagonist but don't get a lot of development. The protector is a character that supports and protects other characters. And then a martyr is almost like a type of, or can be a type of protector. So a character who sacrifices for other characters or for the greater good. So whether that's for the community or for society or for some grand idea, someone who makes sacrifices. And oftentimes with martyrs, that's the ultimate sacrifice, right? Who sacrifices themselves and their lives. So you'll notice with archetypes, we can think of them as being sort of reductive categories where they're very specific, but we can also think of them as sort of able to be joined together. So if we have an ally, the ally might also be a protector or a martyr. A foil might also be a villain or an outsider. So just because we are using these terms doesn't mean that we have to sort of characterize characters as one type of archetype only. A lot of times we can see a lot of different archetypes that are sort of working together. But it helps us to have these categories, and we're talking about characters and the sort of role that they play in narratives. We can use these terms to develop our understanding of the different characters and their relationship to one another and their relationship to the plot and the narrative structure. So with setting, atmosphere, and mood, so when we talk about setting, so when we talk about setting, often we're talking about the physical place that the action takes place in the narrative. So that means also, the sort of objects, the surrounding, the environment of the action and where it takes place, but also the time frame, so the sort of setting in time of where a story takes place. It also means in space, so if we think about fantastical texts or science fiction texts, ones that take place outside of the planet Earth, right, or in a imagined space. That all has to do with the setting. And also cultural context. So what are the expectations for the setting? How do those sort of societal expectations and roles and ideas affect the setting itself and the way that the characters interact within the setting? And setting is something that can often go sort of unnoticed or without recognition by us as readers. And there are different authors that spend more time in terms of their description devoted. They devote more time to setting and describing setting. And setting can also be something that's symbolic, and that reflects the sort of inner status of characters. Some other thoughts about setting. So it does ground the story in time and space. So we have an idea of where these things are happening, where the action is happening. Right, it can reflect themes or thoughts or feelings of characters. And it's often something that's easily readable. So if there's some sort of symbolic nature to the setting, that's usually something that we can see pretty easily. If we think about things like storms, that's often sort of part of the environment or the setting. So storms can often signify some sort of inner turmoil of a character. So when we get to Frankenstein, one of the things that's significant is that Dr. Frankenstein is always experiencing nature in different ways, and some of the time he's experiencing these different storms that reflect his sort of inner guilt, his inner struggle to make a decision about what he needs to do. So the setting, when it's symbolic, when it reflects the themes of a piece of writing, or the sort of grander ideas, that's often something that's easily readable and that we can see within a text. It's useful to talk about personification as well when we talk about setting. So personification is when something non-human takes on human qualities, and that can happen with landscape. And that's often something that in the description of a landscape or the description of the setting, there will be some sort of description of it that allows the setting to have some sort of human qualities. Something that makes the setting come to life and sort of show that. So an example of personification, and this is not of the setting itself, but of the ocean. Santiago remarks, she is kind and very beautiful, but she can be so cruel. So the ocean, the ocean is the setting, the sort of where this is taking place. It's a remark that Santiago makes sort of when he's considering the role of nature and his own sort of relationship to the sea and how it is something that is life-giving for him, but also cruel, right? He hasn't had a lot of luck with his fishing, and so this is something that he's feeling, the sort of ability of it to be beautiful and kind and generous in terms of his livelihood, and something that he appreciates, but also cruel, something that withholds his livelihood from him. So this is an example, right, where personification, and Santiago is personifying, having this ocean, sort of describing it in a way that personifies it. So mood and atmosphere, the sort of emotional tone, and this is often created by diction and rhythm, but also by setting. So the way that the sentences, the syntax is actually constructed, but also the setting itself. So the example with Frankenstein, where there are storms happening that reflects the sort of inner turmoil, the inner emotional angst that he's experiencing. The setting is a reflection of the mood and the atmosphere of the world outside and also within Dr. Frankenstein. But that can also be reflected by this sort of rhythm and the diction of the text. So the anxiety of a setting can be conveyed through the way that it's described. If it's something that evokes anxiety for the protagonist or some of the characters, that might be something that's conveyed through the diction, the rhythm, and the way that the sentences are actually put together, the syntax. So these are things that, if we don't pay attention to them, they can sort of go without us really recognizing their significance. So it's useful for us to take some time to think about the role of setting, the role of atmosphere, and mood, and to think about how these things reflect the themes of a piece of writing and how they help us understand the sort of greater significance of the text. So an example of mood and atmosphere, so from Kafka, so Gregor's glance then turned to the window, the dreary weather, the raindrops were falling audibly down on the metal window ledge, made him quite melancholy. So again, with weather is something that is definitely, we should definitely pay attention to when we're reading. It's often something that is used to reflect the atmosphere of a text. So where, in this case, the weather is reflecting Gregor's own melancholy, his own anxiety, his own feelings of sort of despair. And this is early on in the text where he's sort of discovering himself as as being transformed into an insect. So figurative language is also something that you read about. So figurative language broadly is language that's used to make comparisons and connections. So the examples in your text are metaphor, simile, and imagery. So when we refer to particular instances of figurative language, those are figures of speech. And those are also known as tropes. So with a lot of these words, with literary devices, there are terms, you can use different terms, so like mood and atmosphere can be used sort of simultaneously. Figures of speech and tropes can also be used as synonyms for one another. So focusing first on metaphors and similes. So with metaphors, those are figurative comparisons, and we distinguish metaphor from simile. So similes are metaphors, or they're comparisons, metaphorical comparisons comparing two dissimilar things using the terms like or as, whereas a sort of strict metaphor does not contain like or as and uses some variant of the word to be. So we're saying something is something, rather than saying something is like something, or it's as something else. So there are different types of metaphors that we might identify. So extended metaphors are also called conceits, and those are metaphors that are extended across a large portion of a work, so they don't just exist in one particular instance or one particular example, but they're sort of used and repeated, whether that's in a sort of larger section or throughout most of a text. We use sort of extended metaphors or conceits to refer to metaphors that are not just in sort of a single instance. Implied metaphors are those that are not explicitly stated, but are ones that we can sort of read within the text, where something's not directly stated as this is this, but we can see that there is a metaphorical relationship that's being developed there. Controlling metaphors are those that extend across an entire work, so ones that are, from the sort of beginning to end are a metaphor in the text. So an example that we might look at from our reading this week, so Gregor's transformation into the monstrous insect is an implied and controlling metaphor for his status as an outsider within his family, and also sort of his outsider status within the world as well. Sort of feeling alienated from his job and having this sort of existential angst about his role in the world. So this is, while we're not told explicitly by Kafka, this is this, Gregor's status as a bug is his, alienation. He is a bug. That is something that is we're sort of recognizing as we read the text, right? But we also see this as something that's metaphorical for something more significant. And it's also something that we see throughout the entire text. So we're introduced to Gregor immediately. He is introduced to us as someone who wakes up as an insect, and that is the way that he persists throughout the text. So that is a controlling metaphor. So a simile, a comparison between two dissimilar things, using like or as. So when they're extended across an entire work, they're often referred to as analogies. And an example is the line showed like a phosphorescent streak in the water. So the line itself is not a phosphorescent streak, and explicitly it is in fact the line that he's using to fish, but he's comparing it to a phosphorescent streak, and that serves to sort of give a sort of sense of wonder surrounding the line itself. So rather than sort of seeing it very practically, the line that's holding the fish to the boat, there seems to be, by this simile, we're sort of seeing it in a more sort of poetic sense. So when we think about the role of figurative language in narratives, they often serve to help us recognize greater themes or symbols within the text, and also for us to understand the greater significance of particular moments and particular ideas. So finally we come to imagery. So imagery is a collection of images in a story, poem, or play. And oftentimes we think of imagery because of the name. We think of imagery, images, so a visual element, but it actually refers to any sort of sensory experience. So not just the visual, but also auditory, olfactory, tactile, and gustatory. So auditory being the things that we hear, olfactory being smells, tactile being touch, and then gustatory is taste. So I'd say oftentimes the visual, the auditory, those are things that are described, and tactile often as well, but smell and taste are ones that probably a little bit more rare in terms of these sorts of descriptions and the imagery that takes place in text, but it is something that is important and that is used throughout different narratives. Hemingway actually is somebody who regularly uses imagery in a sense that involves all of the senses. So he's actually, in many cases, trying to dig into the whole experience of a particular character. So he'll do that not just with the visual and auditory, but with the other senses as well. So these imagery serves as placeholders for meaning and sensory experience, but it also helps us to really latch onto the text. It helps us to engage with the text, to imagine what something is like on a deeper level. So not just imagine it in a visual sense, but also try and use our senses to sort of imagine what it would be like to experience what's being described. So it's something that we often refer to. Imagery shows rather than tells. So it's something that allows us to sort of latch onto and imagine the text for ourselves. So an example of imagery, so we have this passage from The Old Man and the Sea. He was asleep in a short time, and he dreamed of Africa when he was a boy, and the long golden beaches and the white beaches, so white they hurt your eyes, and the high capes and the great brown mountains. He lived along that coast now every night, and in his dreams he heard the surf roar and saw the native boats come riding through it. He smelled the tar and oakum of the deck as he slept, and he smelled the smell of Africa that the land breeze brought of morning. So here we have really just gorgeous, vivid imagery, which is something that Hemingway was really a staple of his writing and something that's really remarkable. So the idea, right, of beaches that were so white that they hurt your eyes. So that description alone, we can imagine what that would be like, but we can also sort of sense and sort of remember that sort of pain of any moment where you've had something sort of hurt your eyes. So that becomes visual, but also a sort of tactile experience as well. Imagining the high capes, the great brown mountains. These are the sort of descriptions that we can see in our mind's eye. That hearing the surf roar, so the idea of it roaring, right? Not just, it being loud, but it being a roar. That's something that we can imagine, the sort of sound of it. And even the smell, right? That olfactory sensibility. So the smell of tar and oakum of the deck. So while these might not be things that we're, specifically familiar with as smells, we can maybe imagine the smell of wood, right? And sort of imagine what it would be like to smell that. So he's trying to sort of bring us into the text through our senses, but also convey how meaningful this dream is for Santiago, the significance of the dream for him as he's sort of going back to his boyhood, and that experience of being transported through a dream. So finally, I wanted to talk a little bit about novellas. So novellas are an interesting type of text. So it's kind of a hybrid between a short story and or a longer short story and a short novel. It's neither a short story nor a novel itself. And sometimes they're called novelettes, but that's often infrequent, mostly because novelettes sort of have a sense of a more romantic nature to them, whereas a lot of novellas are not explicitly romantic in terms of romance between two people. So like the novellas that we've read this week are not, they're not romantic in terms of those relationships between people, so they're a lot more serious. So novelette is often sort of a term that's used for like a romantic novella. So novella is generally the term that's used. We're talking about text that exists somewhere between a short story or a long short story and a short novel. So it's one of the categories of prose fiction. So short stories, novels, and novellas are the sort of three categories. Some things that novellas share with both short stories and novels are they take place in particular settings and they follow characters. They have a plot and they have a particular point of view, a specific point of view. And they also, use literary devices, other sorts of literary devices, and like figurative language. Novellas are also interesting because they're published as individual works, like novels are, rather than as part of collections or part of magazines like short stories. So short stories are typically published within a larger work. So whether that is a magazine, like the New Yorker, or as part of a collection of short stories by an author, novellas are published on their own. But one of the things that's important to note about novellas, and particularly in comparison to short stories, is that because of their length, we have a lot more room for development of the plot and the characters. So we can see there's more room for the sort of dynamic character to take place, for us to follow a protagonist or even follow a couple of characters and to have them grow before us and for us to be able to understand that growth and how they've shifted and changed as a result of the plot. And for the plot to just be more lengthy, for there to be more exposition, more rising action, and for there to even potentially have sort of more than one sort of critical moment or climactic moment within the narrative. That's not to say that every novella will have a very protracted, sort of exposition or rising action. In fact, really with the Metamorphoses is a good example because we don't get very much exposition at all. We're sort of thrown into the rising action of Gregor's waking up as an insect and the events that follow that lead to the sort of climactic moments that he deals with, and ultimately, of course, his death. So there's room, of course, like any narrative, for authors to play with these sort of narrative structures. But typically the sort of length of the novella does allow for a little bit more development and for, development of characters and development of plot. So the two novellas that you're reading for this week, or that you've read for this week, are Ernest Hemingway's The Old Man and the Sea, and then Franz Kafka's The Metamorphoses. So a little bit of background about these writers and about the texts themselves. So Ernest Hemingway was a writer, so he lived from 1899 to 1961. So he started his writing career as a journalist and then switched to writing fiction. And he still did a little bit of journalistic work, but he made his way, and he's known for his fiction writing specifically. So some of his famous works are The Sun Also Rises, The Old Man and the Sea, of course, A Farewell to Arms, and For Whom the Bell Tolls, among many other works. And he also wrote short stories and poetry, although he isn't known for his poetry. Some of his short stories are very well known, however. So he was, a prolific writer, someone who was known as a writer and who really thought of himself as a writer. Writing was his passion. Writing was something that he, made his career as a writer. So The Old Man and the Sea was one of the last works that he actually published during his lifetime. There are several works that were published posthumously after his suicide. And he did commit suicide, so this is a significant work in his sort of literary oeuvre, his sort of larger body of texts. And it contributed to his winning several prizes for literature, so the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction and also the Nobel Prize in Literature. So even though it is a shorter text than many of his novels, it was a significant text for him. It's a piece of work that is absolutely masterful in terms of craft, and also in terms of the sort of way that it engages with these very real themes of life and death, and our relationship, sort of humanity's relationship with nature. And that was something that was very important to Hemingway. He was someone who, not only was he a writer, but he was also an avid fisherman. He was an outdoorsman. He was a hunter. But he was someone who really appreciated nature. And he often focused on nature in his fiction, and explored the sort of relationship between the natural world and humanity, and also used it as a way of thinking about death and the way that life is, comparatively speaking to in terms of the natural larger world. Our lives are but a blip, in that larger story of nature, and how that being in nature is something that can humble us and sort of make us aware of our existence, and our sort of part in this grander sort of natural world. So Hemingway was had a reverence for nature. That's something that's well documented, and that a lot of scholars have written about. So this text, of course, is Santiago's struggle to catch and bring this enormous marlin to shore. So we can see this as we can interpret it, or one way to interpret it is as a sort of metaphor for the struggles and failures of life, and also a representation of the power of nature. That the fish itself can be a representation of nature, and our struggle to sort of fight against it in order to live, and to continue living. Since Santiago must have this marlin to make his living. He talks about the sort of consumption of the fish in order to continue surviving. So there is this sort of dynamic relationship between humanity and nature that's developed. But the sort of living and dying ideas that are explored there, with the old man being sort of closer to death and remembering his boyhood, and recognizing the sort of youth and vitality of the boy that fishes with him, and also recognizing the vitality of this fish that he's attempting to kill, and feeling complicated relationship to the fish, calling it brother, and sort of recognizing their common mortality. A little bit of information about the Metamorphosis. So Franz Kafka lived from 1883 to 1924. He was a writer. He also worked as a lawyer, and he was from Austria-Hungary, which is now the Czech Republic, and he lived most of his life in Prague. So he was someone who really had this great desire to write and to create through his writing, but he also was somebody who struggled with this social pressure and expectation to work in a career that was going to make money. So he worked as a lawyer, and he has written about his struggles and his frustration with having to sort of prioritize his work as a lawyer over his writing, and how he wishes that he could just be a writer. So that was something that was a struggle for him. And the struggle, I think, that we can read in the Metamorphosis is sort of relationship between the things that we have to do, the roles that we have in society or within family, and our desires, and not being able to explore those things. So he had complicated relationships with various women that he was in love with, and also with his family, and specifically with his father. And you'll notice that the Metamorphosis, the relationship between Gregor and his father, is very strained once Gregor is no longer able to provide for his family. That's something that immediately, his status, his transformed status, immediately alienates him from his father, and his father then becomes rather antagonistic towards him, right? Even resulting in ultimately one of the blows that contributes to Gregor's death. So also as a Jew in Prague, he was part of this sort of vibrant life of Jews in the city. There was a large Jewish population in Prague during the time that he was living in Prague. But he also, it's documented that he felt alienated from his heritage as well. So there are a number of ways that Franz Kafka experienced alienation and struggle with his sort of role in life. And that's something that we can read if we look at the text from a biographical sense. We can read in the Metamorphosis. So this text was published in 1915. If we think about Gregor's alienation from his family, so we can interpret that as a larger metaphor for Gregor's feelings of otherness in relation to his family, his profession, and also his role in society. Something that is we can trace as being informed by Kafka's own life. So I wanted to take some time, as you guys have been engaging with close reading, and I know that for some of you this is a challenge in sort of thinking about how we read texts and how we see them as part of the greater text itself, but also how we sort of take a step back from the text and think about it in relationship to the significance of the passage and the significance of the text as a whole. So I wanted to take some time to do some close reading. So this passage is from The Old Man and the Sea, of course, by Ernest Hemingway. And the sort of where the text comes into play in the greater text of The Old Man and the Sea is it's after Santiago has hooked the great marlin. He's feeling a sort of kindredness, sympathy, and connection to the marlin, which makes him remember this moment that is described here, and I'll read it for us in a second. So this moment is sort of part of a greater moment of recognition for Santiago and a shifting of his feelings within the narrative, as his determination up until this point has been to catch and kill the fish, and he's suddenly sort of recognizing the fish as another living being, and finding pity and sympathy for the fish. So this is something that speaks to Hemingway's appreciation of nature and the balance between life and death, humanity and nature. So I want to read the text itself. And as we're reading, I would encourage you to think about what stands out to you from the text. So this is one way to get very practiced with close reading, is to sort of position yourself as an observer of the text as well. So thinking about things that stand out to you, whether those are significant terms, patterns, diction and syntax, different recognition of literary devices, and so forth. So I want us, as we're reading, to for yourself, take note of those things. He remembered the time he had hooked one of a pair of marlin. The male fish always let the female fish feed first, and the hooked fish, the female, made a wild, panic-stricken, despairing fight that soon exhausted her, and all the time the male had stayed with her, crossing the line and circling with her on the surface. He had stayed so close that the old man was afraid he would cut the line with his tail, which was sharp as a scythe, and almost of that size and shape. When the old man had gaffed her and clubbed her, holding the rapier bill with its sandpaper edge and dubbing her across the top of her head until her color turned to a color almost like the backing of mirrors, and then, with the boy's aid, hoisted her aboard, the male fish had stayed by the side of the boat. Then, while the old man was clearing the lines and preparing the harpoon, the male fish jumped high into the air beside the boat to see where the female was, and then went down deep. His lavender wings, that were his pectoral fins, spread wide, and all his wide lavender stripes showing. He was beautiful, the old man remembered, and he had stayed. That was the saddest thing I ever saw with them, the old man thought. The boy was sad too, and we begged her pardon and butchered her promptly. So if we're thinking about this text, we understand where it takes place in the story, within the narrative. Some things that we might recognize as part of our close reading are repetition of terms. So one of the things that stands out to me as a reader is the repetition of stayed. So we have several instances where we have the word stayed repeated. Oops, accidentally switched there. So here, that he had stayed, And let's see, up here, the male had stayed with her. Here, the fish had stayed by the side of the boat. And here, he had stayed so close that the old man was afraid he would cut the line. So we have this repetition of stayed. The male stayed, the fish stayed. And we can read that as the sort of significance of what Santiago is remembering and his recognition of the relationship between these two fish. So he seems to be so impressed by the fact and so sort of devastated by the fact that the male marlin stayed, because it speaks to this deeper relationship between the fish and a sensibility of partnership, something that he and his the boy that he fishes with have disrupted by killing the female, something that provokes a lot of grief for him, really. We also have an example of here we go. The line here, so he says he would cut the line with his tail, which was sharp as a scythe and almost of that size and shape. So we have a simile here as the tail of the marlin is compared to a scythe. And that's significant too if we think about scythe as being a sharp instrument, something that provokes a sort of sense of awe, but also a scythe being something that can be symbolic of death, something that sort of character of death is often sort of associated with. So that's something that we can see as being significant too. It's also interesting because if the tail had cut the line, then the female would potentially be saved. So there's that potential there for the female to be saved, but that's not what happens within the story. There's also a description of the color of the fish and this sort of contrast between and juxtaposition of the color of the female when she's caught, which you say here, until her color turned to a color almost like the backing of mirrors. So we imagine that as sort of like a brown paper, something that's unremarkable, and that being juxtaposed with the sort of vivaciousness of the lavender wings that are described here with the male fish. The lavender stripes showing, so that sort of juxtaposition of color between the dead fish, so death and life, if we think about these two fish being sort of symbolic of those two things, and the sort of sharpness of the line between life and death. It's also significant, I think, that he describes the fish as beautiful. So that shows a recognition of the value that the fish has, and the old man's appreciation for that and his memory. So his appreciation of it in the moment, and that appreciation that persists as he continues to remember the fish as beautiful. So that there's a reverence there for nature that we can read in the text. So he also qualifies it as the saddest thing that I ever saw with them, with the fish, right? This sort of the beauty of the relationship between the fish, the sort of vivaciousness of life and love and partnership, companionship, which is something that Santiago is missing really at this point when he's alone in the boat and he's been sort of ostracized from his society, that's disrupted. And that's part of the sadness for him here, is that that partnership, that vivaciousness, that life has been disrupted, right? It's been turned to death, it's been turned to solitariness, and to solitude and singleness. And that's something that Santiago identifies with here with the fish, as he's remembering this memory and also identifying with the fish that he now has on the hook, right? Starting to remember this example and then translating those feelings into pity and recognition and reverence, and even a sense of brotherhood with the fish that he has. He calls the marlin that he has on his hook at present a brother. So this passage is significant because it speaks to this theme of precariousness of life and also the beauty of life, but also the way that life can be cut so short, and the way that the natural world, we often think of it as separate from us, but there is a lot that we can sort of take between our relationship as humans, and the relationship that we have with nature, and that common sort of precariousness of life, and the devastation that death causes, right? The changes that death causes, and also that relationship between sort of camaraderie and community and solitude and aloneness, loneliness. That's something that Santiago seems to be identifying with here. And these are themes that we can take from the text itself, is this sort of fighting that Santiago has to not be ostracized from his community, to persist, to continue to live, right? So as an old man, he's lived his life, but he has more life to live. So he's fighting against the sort of natural status of humanity, right? That we live and then we die. But he's also fighting to be part of his community and to be recognized as part of his community. So if we think about that, this passage in relation to the text as a whole, we can see these themes coming into play. The last close reading I want to do is from the Metamorphosis by Franz Kafka. So this passage is in part 2 in the Metamorphosis, and it's when Gret, his sister, Gregor's sister, has persuaded her mother to take the furniture out of Gregor's room. So this is a crucial moment in the rising action of the novella, as it's a sort of point of conflict in the text. And it's followed by Gregor, this particular passage is followed by Gregor covering the photo of the woman that's wearing nothing but the fur. And if we think about that image, that the woman in fur, that image is a sort of symbol of humanity, a symbol of sexuality, a symbol of that sort of recognition of sexuality as part of being human. And it's the thing that Gregor chooses to cover, that he's sort of resisting having his humanity taken away by having his furniture taken away and this photo being taken away. So, after this passage, following this passage, right before it, we've had his mother and Gret sort of taking the chest of drawers out of his room and taking the desk out of his room. But this is Gregor's sort of moment and a sort of panic moment for him when he realizes what's happening and then decides to cover the photo, which results in his mother fainting and Gret sort of yelling at Gregor and blaming him. And this is one of the sort of larger moments within the text that we see where his humanity is being stripped away by the circumstances of the text and also by his family, actively taking away his dignity and also what the things that help to sort of anchor him to what remains of his humanity and his humanness and the memory of what it was to be human, and that further ostracize him and alienate him from his family. So Gregor, if we think about archetypes, he is a protagonist, but he's an outsider. He really fits that outsider archetype very well. So I want to read this passage and then talk about some of the things that we notice. So just like with the other passage, make sure that as we read that you're taking note of things that stand out to you. These are, close readings are something that are often individualized, so we're developing our own interpretations, we're responding to the text, we're noticing certain things. But the benefit of close reading and having close readings that we share, which is something that you're doing through your discussions, is that we can get different perspectives of the text. So things that maybe I wouldn't notice, you would notice, and your peers might notice. So we get a deeper reading of the text. So one thing that's important with close reading is to resist reading for the interpretation, or looking for the one possible meaning of the text. It's important to recognize that there are many possible ways that we can interpret text and that we can understand text, both within particular passages, but also with, text as a whole. So I'll read the section for us. Although Gregor kept repeating to himself over and over that really nothing unusual was going on, that only a few pieces of furniture were being rearranged, He soon had to admit to himself that the movements of the women to and fro, their quiet conversations, the scratching of the furniture and the floor, affected him like a great swollen commotion on all sides, and, so firmly was he pulling in his head and legs and pressing his body into the floor, he had to tell himself unequivocally that he wouldn't be able to endure all this much longer. They were cleaning out his room, taking away from him everything he cherished. They had already dragged out the chest of drawers in which the fret saw and other tools were kept, and they were now loosening the writing desk which was fixed tight to the floor, the desk on which he, as a business student, a school student, indeed even as an elementary school student, had written out his assignments. At that moment he really didn't have any more time to check the good intentions of the two women, whose existence he had in any case almost forgotten, because in their exhaustion they were working really silently, and the heavy stumbling of their feet was the only sound to be heard. So one of the things that stands out in this passage to me as a reader is the imagery, and the way that the imagery is sort of listed. So the listing in itself provokes a sort of atmosphere, mood in the text of anxiety and distress, and we're sort of feeling the distress that Gregor has at what's happening around him. So there are a lot of commas you might notice, and a lot of his sentences are sort of protracted here. So we have a lot of use of commas, so that we have clauses that are sort of pushed together, and that conveys a sort of franticness that we have of his thoughts racing and his anxiety about what's happening as the women, his family members, take away these sort of emblems of his humanity and of his past as a human. We have a simile where he says here, the scratching of the furniture and the floor affected him like a great swollen commotion on all sides. So this is kind of an interesting simile. So the scratching of the furniture being like a great swollen commotion. So that's really not something that's very tangible, but it evokes a sort of sense of something that's unbearable, a swollen commotion, that actually having a sort of tangibleness to it, and really a sort of personification of it, something that takes up space, that's a negative thing, a swollen commotion, something that is consuming and it's pressing in on him from all sides. We can get the sense of that anxiety and the sort of almost a sense of this like physical pain that's Gregor is suffering. And there's a word for Kafka's writing, Kafkaesque, this sort of existential anxiety, and that's evoked in this sort of grotesque aspect of writing, where it's realistic, but it's also sort of, there's a lot of intangible elements. So this is an example of something that we might deem Kafkaesque, sort of significant of his style of writing. So the silent stumbling of their feet is also something that's significant. So for them, right, in a way that this sort of relationship between his mother and Gred and himself is an antagonistic one, as they're taking away from him these things that sort of are emblems of his, or symbols of his humanity. But he's sort of seeing them in this moment, since they're not in the room at this present moment, as being reduced to the heavy sound of the heavy stumbling feet, right? That's the only sound that he can hear. And in a way, it seems like he's sort of trying to distance himself from them, because he's sort of saying here that he didn't have any more time to check their good intentions, to sort of recognize that what they were doing was with good intent, because he feels that they're taking an antagonistic position against him, right? They're taking his sense of humanity from him. So in a way, he's sort of reducing them to sound, because he's going to face them. Other things that are significant, so we have the stripping of the furniture. So we've mentioned here the taking away from him everything he cherished. So there's a sense of anxiety there and frustration. So the chest of drawers, oh goodness, whoops. The chest of drawers, he says, in which his fret saw and other tools were kept. So if we think about the importance of tools to humanity, right? Tools are what separate us from insects, from animals. They allow us to to think and to create and to build. And these things are being taken from Gregor, these things that were significant to his sort of sense of his humanity. The desk is also a symbol of his humanity in that it is a symbol of his education, of his intelligence, of his ability to think and to learn, of his sort of history or career as a student, right? So as a business student, a school student, an elementary student, where he did his writing and his thinking. So these are things that are being stripped from him, these sort of aspects of his humanity, his abilities to think, his abilities to create, to do more than just sort of scurrying around, which he recognizes in himself that these are things that have been taken from him, but it's made a lot more real to him when these sort of symbols, things that he's cherished because of his past and what they mean for him symbolically, are being taken from him. So that's part of the anxiety of this, is that we're seeing sort of stripping of his humanity by his own family. So we think about the significance of this passage. It represents this sort of greater themes of alienation and outsiderness, but also feelings of separation from oneself, one's own past, and one's own family, one's own profession, one's own place in society. So really, we have this larger metaphor through Gregor's transformation into this insect status, which is, typically an object of repulsion, insects. So his physical transformation is a metaphor for or we can read it as a metaphor for his alienation from his life, and also for a sort of sense of existential angst, right? If your existence is sort of boiled down in these ways, and he's seeing his history as a human and his position in his family being stripped away, then it causes a sense of existential angst, right? What are we doing here? And if we define ourselves only by our relationships to other people or to our jobs or to society, what do we have left if those things are stripped away? So it speaks to this larger existential angst, which is something that is pretty significant and pretty something that exists, is a pattern for Kafka's writing, and also part of that sort of Kafkaesque description and Kafkaesque writing. So I hope it helps to have those examples. If we think about close reading, your goal with close reading is to position the passages within the larger text and to think about their significance on their own. So how we can read, repetition, diction, syntax, looking for literary devices, looking for themes within the passage itself, but also connect that to the larger text. How these passages contribute to the plot, to our understanding of characters, to the greater themes, to larger metaphors within text, controlling metaphors or extended metaphors. So these are things that we're looking for. So if you want to think about it as sort of using a microscope or taking a microscope and looking at a particular part of the text, that might be a helpful way of thinking about what we do with close reading, is we're sort of zooming into a particular part of the text and then also zooming out to think about how it relates to the text as a whole, the greater text. And it's something that takes practice. So if it's something that was a little bit difficult for you when you were doing it the first time, that's okay. Part of what we're doing and what we need to learn to do is to read with a critical eye and analytical eye. And part of that is just learning the terms for things, right? So thinking about, the sort of things that we have in our tool belt, terms and literary devices that we can read for, that we can look for when we're examining texts, that can help us to come to these conclusions and to interpret the text in a bigger way and look for significance. So that's all for this week. So I hope you will, enjoy these two texts and appreciate them. I will say the Metamorphosis is a lot more, it's a lot darker than, in terms of the sort of mood of it and tone of it, than The Old Man and the Sea, which is a lot more hopeful. But as we think about the relationship between these two novellas and the themes for the course, I hope you can see the significance of that outsider status. So when it's something that is thrust upon you in particular, these two characters have the similarity in that their outsiderness is sort of thrust upon them, and they're working to resist that outsiderness, which is something that Santiago is able to do by virtue of catching this fish and being recognized as a great fisherman, but Gregor is not. So you might also think about those relationships too, and how the ability to, resist remaining an outsider affects our understanding of the texts versus Gregor's, frustration with and ultimately his death as a result of not being able to come back into the fold, as it were. So if you have questions, feel free to email me, and I will talk to you next week.